Stop. Before you scroll past this, I need you to hear one sentence. In 1864, Union soldiers forced open a locked iron door on a Georgia plantation and found 23 children huddled in total darkness beneath the ground. No sunlight, no sound, no way out. Every single one of those children had the same pale green eyes, the same auburn hair shot through with gold, the same sharp, high cheekbones. They looked to the soldiers standing at the top of those stairs like they had all come from the same person. Because they had. When the oldest girl, 13 years old, shielding her eyes from the first daylight she'd seen in months, was asked why they were there, why the door had been locked, why they couldn't simply leave, she looked at the soldier and said something that made a decorated war veteran physically step backward. She said, "Mistress says we are her legacy. We cannot leave because we are her blood." Her blood. Not her property, not her workers, her blood. The soldier who wrote about that moment in a letter home said he had seen things in 3 years of war he expected would follow him forever. The sight of men dying in the mud, the sound of artillery before dawn, the smell of a battlefield in summer heat. But nothing, he wrote, had prepared him for those green eyes looking up from the dark. Now here is the part that makes this story unlike anything else buried in the American historical record. The woman who created those children, who designed the system that locked them in that basement, who spent 16 years building what she called her legacy, was already dead. She had been dead for over a year, killed by the very people she had enslaved. Her body hidden somewhere on the property she had bled others to maintain. And not one single person, not one of the 40 people who lived and worked on that land had breathed a word of it to anyone. For over a year, they had kept her secret, because the secret protected them, and because in the most complicated and human way possible, they believed she had earned exactly what happened to her. This is the story of Catherine Thornhill. It does not begin with violence. It does not begin with darkness. It begins with something far more ordinary, far more dangerous. It begins with a debt, and a woman who decided on a cold February night in 1847 she would rather destroy the world than admit she had lost. What she wrote down that night would be the last thing 16-year-old Richard Thornhill ever saw coming.
The Widow's Calculation. Burke County, Georgia, February 1847. The coldest winter in 20 years. Catherine Danforth Thornhill stood at the edge of her husband's grave, her black dress stiff in the February wind, and did not cry. She was calculating. Jonathan Thornhill had been, by all accounts, a charming man and a catastrophic businessman. He inherited Thornhill Estate in 1838, 1,700 acres of red clay farmland, a 2-story federal-style brick mansion, 42 enslaved workers, and manageable debt. By the time fever took him at 44, he had gambled away most of the profits, sold 16 people to satisfy creditors, and left the property so mortgaged that Catherine's lawyer laid out her options in a single sentence. Sell everything and go home to Augusta. Or find a miracle. Catherine was 28 years old. She had married Jonathan at 19. She spoke passable French. She had been raised deliberately and thoroughly to manage a household and protect a legacy. What she had not been raised for was failure. Returning to Augusta, arriving as a penniless failed widow dependent on family charity indefinitely, was not something Catherine could accept. Not emotionally, not psychologically. It was simply not a possible outcome. So, She sat with the account books night after night, candle burning to nothing, mind working through every conventional option and finding each one insufficient. She couldn't afford to purchase more workers. The cotton market was depressed. The soil was exhausted. The 31 people remaining on the property were not enough to work the fields profitably. She had no money coming in and creditors circling like vultures up the fence line. But somewhere in those long, silent nights, staring at numbers that didn't add up no matter how she arranged them, something shifted in Catherine's thinking. Something cold, something logical, something entirely without mercy. And when the idea finally arrived, when it took shape in her mind with the clean, simple certainty of a mathematical proof, she picked up her pen. She opened a fresh journal. She began to write. That journal would eventually contain enough evidence to destroy everything Catherine had built. It would be decoded twice, once by a boy who paid with his life, and once by a girl who used it to end Catherine's world entirely. But on that February night, only Catherine knew it existed, and what she was writing inside it had no name in 1847. It would take another 100 years before the world had a word for what she was designing.
The breeding log. Catherine Thornhill's journal was written in cipher. Agricultural language, carefully chosen to disguise what it truly described. Children became seedlings. The men she selected became rootstock. Pregnancies were plantings. Expected births were harvests. To any eye that might find it, the journal looked like notes from a meticulous farmer. In reality, it was a blueprint for something that had no name in 1847. We would call it a eugenics program today. A forced breeding operation. A system designed to manufacture enslaved human beings and bind them so completely to one piece of land that escape would be, in the most literal sense, impossible. Catherine's logic was this. She couldn't afford to buy workers, but she was still young enough to bear children. And if she selected carefully, chose the strongest, healthiest men from the enslaved population, conceived children with them, raised those children as part of the estate's workforce, she could build her labor supply entirely from within. Not passively, not haphazardly, systematically. Her own children would be the first generation. When they reached maturity, they would be paired with other enslaved people on the property. Their children would be the second generation, their children's children the third. Within 30 years, Catherine calculated she could have a workforce of 100 or more, all descended from her, all bound to Thornhill estate by ties that went deeper than law or chains. They couldn't be sold, they were her own blood. They couldn't run, where would they go? Their entire identity existed within these 1,700 acres. She began with a man named Isaac, 24 years old, born on the plantation, known for his steady temperament and physical strength. She summoned him to the main house one March evening in 1847, after the overseer had gone to his cottage, after the quarters had gone quiet. What happened in that house was not consent. In a system where refusing a direct command could mean whipping, sale, or something worse, the word consent had no meaning. Catherine recorded it in her journal with 4 words. First planting completed. Rootstock 1. She was pregnant by April, and upstairs in the library above her study, a boy named Richard was watching her with eyes that missed nothing. What he didn't know yet, what would take him 3 more months to discover, was that the journal existed at all. And what he didn't know after that, what he would never get the chance to act on, was that Catherine had already noticed him watching, and had already decided what to do about it.
The boy who knew too much. Richard Thornhill was not supposed to be in the library that afternoon, but he was there, hidden behind a tall bookcase in the back corner, reading as he spent most of his time reading, when Catherine led Mrs. Miriam Grayson into the adjacent parlor and closed the door. Not quite all the way closed. Mrs. Grayson was Burke County's midwife, a sharp, efficient woman of 50 with a reputation for discretion so carefully maintained it had become its own kind of advertisement. "You're certain of your condition?" Mrs. Grayson asked. "Quite certain," Catherine replied. "Early December, I think." A pause, careful. "And Mr. Thornhill passed in February, you said." "My late husband and I were intimate in January," Catherine said. Her voice was perfectly level. "Shortly before his final illness." "Of course." Richard stopped breathing. He had sat with his father through the entire month of January. He had watched Jonathan Thornhill fight for each breath, too weak to sit upright, too feverish to recognize the faces around his bed. There had been no intimacy in January. There had barely been consciousness. The child Catherine was carrying had been conceived after Jonathan's death, conceived with someone else, and Catherine intended to pass it off as her late husband's heir and build her entire future on a lie so complete that no one would ever be able to challenge it. Richard gathered evidence over the following weeks. He watched Catherine summon Isaac to the main house after dark. He noted the dates. He watched the pattern build. By July, he was certain. In August, while Catherine was in Waynesboro on business, he picked the lock on her writing desk and found the journal. 3 days to crack the cipher. What he translated destroyed something in him permanently. Not just the affair, not just the coming deception. The scope, the charts, the population projections, the planned pairings across generations, diagrams that looked like livestock breeding records, because that was exactly what they were. He copied several pages. His hands were shaking so badly the letters barely held together. He had his proof. That night at dinner, Catherine looked up from her plate. "Richard," she said pleasantly, "have you been in my study recently? Some of my papers seem disturbed." Every drop of blood left his face. She looked at him with an expression so calm it was almost gentle. "Family loyalty is everything. Without it, we are simply animals." That night, Richard burned the copied pages. He had lost the evidence. What he had not lost, yet, was his life. But Catherine had already started working on that. The tonic. It started with fatigue. That was always how it started. Richard had read it in a medical encyclopedia on the third shelf of his library. The chapter he had memorized, almost without meaning to, over the last few months. By September, he found himself exhausted by mid-afternoon, unable to concentrate. His appetite vanished. Headaches arrived like hammers behind his eyes and stayed for hours. By October, muscle weakness, stomach cramps, a persistent tremor in his hands when he tried to hold a pen. Catherine showed tremendous concern. She dismissed his usual attendant and began preparing his meals herself, something she had never done for anyone. She brought him thin soup and soft bread. She adjusted his pillows. She sat beside his bed and pressed a cool hand to his forehead and spoke to him in a low, gentle voice about rest and recovery and how very much she cared about his well-being. She summoned Mrs. Grayson, who diagnosed nervous exhaustion, possibly the early stages of consumption. She prescribed rest, fresh air, and a special tonic Catherine would obtain from a pharmacy in Augusta. "Tuberculosis often strikes young men of sensitive disposition," Catherine told him softly. "Your father had a cousin who died of it at just your age. We must be very vigilant." Richard looked at her from the pillow. She looked back at him with an expression of perfect, practiced concern. He knew the chapter on arsenic poisoning by heart. Fatigue, digestive distress, progressive muscle weakness, gradual deterioration mimicking any number of natural diseases, virtually undetectable if the doses were carefully managed over weeks and months. He knew exactly what the tonic was. But he was too weak to run, too isolated to get help unobserved. Every servant in the house obeyed Catherine without question. By November, he no longer had the strength to reach the window unaided. He had one chance left. Working for a few minutes at a time between waves of exhaustion, he composed a letter to his grandfather in Augusta. He described everything: the journal, the cipher, the program, what he believed was happening to him, and why. He sealed it. He called the youngest house servant, a girl named Pearl, maybe 13, and pressed the letter into her hands and begged her with his last real energy to post it in Waynesboro without telling a soul. Pearl looked at the letter. She looked at Richard. She walked directly to Catherine's study. Catherine read the letter at Richard's bedside. Then she walked to the fireplace. And as Richard watched from his pillow, she dropped it in.
4 days. Catherine folded her hands. She sat in the chair beside Richard's bed, the way a mother sits beside a sick child, close, attentive, composed. "You're very ill, darling," she said softly. Richard said nothing. The fever affects the mind, makes a person see patterns that aren't there, imagine things that couldn't possibly be real. She reached out and laid her hand over his on the blanket. "It's one of the cruelest symptoms. I've read about it extensively." "I know what's in the tonic," Richard said. His voice was barely a whisper. Catherine did not flinch, did not look away, did not remove her hand. "You're a good boy," she said. "Smarter than your father, honestly, though I would never have said so while he was living." She smoothed the blanket over his chest with careful hands. "It's a mercy, really, that you won't have to suffer much longer." She stood. She left the room. She did not return that evening. Richard Thornhill died on December 3rd, 1847. He was 16 years old, 3 weeks from his 17th birthday. The doctor from Waynesboro recorded consumption as the cause of death, tragic speed of deterioration, common in young men of delicate constitution. Catherine wept at the funeral. 3 separate witnesses later described her grief as genuine and heartbreaking. She wore mourning black for a full year, and 4 days after they buried Richard Thornhill in the family plot beside his father, 4 days, Catherine gave birth to a healthy son. She named him Jonathan, after her late husband. She claimed the child had arrived slightly premature. Nobody in Burke County did the arithmetic out loud. And so Thornhill Estate moved forward into its next chapter, a chapter of quiet, steady, systematic growth that would last 8 more years before the outside world caught even the first whisper of what was truly happening behind those whitewashed brick walls. By 1856, Catherine had given birth 5 more times. By 1856, she had registered every one of those children as legally enslaved in the Burke County records. By 1856, she had built something in the east wing of the main house that she kept locked at all times, a room that no one except Catherine herself was ever permitted to enter. And by 1856, she had begun making plans for what would happen when those children grew old enough to fulfill the role she had designed for them. Plans that one of those children, a 14-year-old girl named Eleanor, was about to find, decode, and turn into a weapon. The children of the main house. By 1856, 10 children lived in or near the main house.
They ranged in age from 8 years old down to infancy. To any outside eye, they might have appeared to be orphans, taken in by a generous church-going widow. Catherine had used exactly that story. Fortunate orphans, Christian charity, the kind of thing respectable widows did. The truth was something the outside world had no language to describe. All 10 children were legally enslaved. Catherine had registered them in the county records as the children of enslaved women on the property, which gave her legal ownership of her own biological offspring, a fact so grotesque it barely seems real even now, 160 years later. But in practice, they lived differently. Better food, decent clothing, sleeping in or near the main house rather than the quarters, and Catherine taught them, illegally in a state where educating enslaved people was a crime, to read and write. She told them they were lucky, that she had saved them, that the world outside Thornhill estate was dangerous and indifferent. She was right about the last part, for her own reasons. The eldest, young Jonathan, 8 years old in 1856, with his mother's pale green eyes and his biological father Isaac's broad frame, called Catherine mother, without knowing how literally true that was. Isaac had been sold to an Alabama plantation in 1849, once Catherine had no further use for him. In the quarters beyond the oak trees, the enslaved workers watched all of this with an understanding that needed no textbook to develop. They saw how Catherine measured the children periodically, how she noted their development in her locked journal with the focused attention of someone managing an experiment. They understood that these children were being prepared, that the nightmare they were living had not yet reached its final shape. What they didn't know, and what Catherine had spent 3 years constructing in the locked room at the end of the East Wing, was how far ahead she had already planned. The Heritage Room, she called it. Inside, 3 volumes of coded journals, rows of small glass vials, each containing a lock of hair, each labeled with a name and a date, organized by generation. And on the central table, elaborate charts connecting names with lines and notations stretching decades into the future. The planned pairings of children who were, in 1856, still in the nursery. Catherine had designed their futures before they were old enough to walk. And one of them, the most observant, the most dangerous, the one Catherine should have watched most carefully, was about to find the key.
The girl who decoded everything. Eleanor had always been the one who asked uncomfortable questions. At 14, in the spring of 1863, she was the most observant person in the main house, possibly on the entire estate. She read everything she could find. She filed things away. She had learned very early that information was the only form of power available to her. In May, while helping organize papers in Catherine's study, she found one of the journals sitting in plain view. Unlocked. Whether this was carelessness or a test, Eleanor never determined. She took it. She recognized the cipher within hours, a substitution pattern, agricultural language. It took her 3 weeks of stolen minutes to decode it fully. What she read destroyed her understanding of her entire existence. Her own conception recorded in 4 clinical words. Second planting, rootstock 2, Thomas, age 21, anticipate harvest, late October, 1848. Thomas. She knew Thomas. A quiet man in his late 30s who worked the far fields and never made eye contact with anyone from the main house, who flinched almost imperceptibly whenever Catherine crossed the yard. He was her father. Catherine was her mother. She was not an orphan saved by Christian charity. She was a designed product of a deliberate system.
conceived, born, educated, and kept for a single purpose that the journal's later entries spelled out with clinical clarity. Eleanor was scheduled. Her children, the children Catherine intended for her to have, were already notated in the heritage room charts as projected assets of the next generation. She put the journal down. She sat very still for a long time. Then she stood, walked down the hallway, and found Catherine in the sitting room. "I read your journal," Eleanor said. Catherine looked up. Her face went completely still. "I know what you are, and I know what I am." What Catherine said next was the last thing Eleanor had expected. She didn't deny it. She didn't threaten, not immediately. She told the truth, all of it, calmly, methodically, in the tone of a woman presenting a business arrangement to a moderately intelligent subordinate. And at the end of it, she explained what would happen if Eleanor chose not to cooperate. She would be sold, somewhere far away, somewhere Eleanor's literacy would be seen as a liability rather than an asset, somewhere she would never be found. Eleanor looked at her hands in her lap. She said nothing. Catherine believed the matter was settled. She had no idea that the moment she left that room, Eleanor went to find Jonathan, and that Jonathan would find Abigail, and that by the time the sun rose the next morning, the truth had begun moving through Thornhill estate like a fire Catherine had not planned for and could not contain. The truth moves like fire. Jonathan's reaction nearly broke Eleanor. He was 16. 16 years of careful conditioning had done its work. He couldn't locate the world without Catherine in the center of it. "She gave us a better life," he said, genuinely confused. Not defending her, just unable to see past her. "We are property, Jonathan. She registered us as enslaved. She legally owns us. She keeps us together. If we were sold, we are going to be paired and sold to each other. That is what those charts in her room mean. She plans to breed our children and their children until this entire estate is populated by her descendants who have nowhere to go because they're all each other's family." Jonathan went quiet. "She's my mother," he said. "She is your enslaver," Eleanor replied. "Those two things are not in conflict. That is the entire horror of what she did." He couldn't fully absorb it. Not yet. But Abigail, 13, sharp as glass, understood immediately. And Margaret at 12 understood too. The knowledge moved through the main house like water through cracked walls, and then, carefully, it began moving into the quarters. Eleanor started finding reasons to be near the workers' cabins in the evenings. She sat with the older women. She listened. She heard, for the first time, the full scope of what Catherine had built over 16 years. Ruth, who had run 4 miles and been dragged back. The women who had lost pregnancies that weren't naturally lost. The men summoned to the main house after dark and returned changed. One October evening, in a clearing in the pine forest where no light from the main house reached, Eleanor sat with a circle of older women. A woman named Hope, 40s, quiet, with the stillness of someone who has survived things they cannot fully speak about, looked at Eleanor for a long moment. "Your mama thinks she made family here," Hope said. "All she made was people who hate her in ways she can't even understand." "What if we didn't wait for the war to end?" Eleanor said into the fire. Nobody moved. "What if we ended this?" The idea sat between them in the dark. Nobody said no. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 7 months later, Catherine would force the issue herself. She would gather all 11 of her children in the main house on the night of March 17, 1864. She would lead them to the heritage room, and she would show them the bottles. The bottles, Catherine explained, contained laudanum. In large doses, she said, it provided what she called eternal peace. She reasoned that if the Union forces came, if the enslaved population was freed and the system dismantled, her children would have nowhere to go. They were not white enough for white society, and they were not known in the black community of Burke County. Their entire identity existed within these 1,700 acres, and leaving would mean belonging to nothing and no one. She believed it was better to end it together as a family on their own terms, and she reached for the bottles. Jonathan stepped in front of her. He was 16, nearly her height, and something in his face had changed in the months since Eleanor had shown him the journal, something that had slowly hardened from confusion into something colder and clearer. He said no, quietly. When Catherine looked at him and reminded him he had always understood the plan, Jonathan revealed that he had read what she actually wrote about Isaac, Thomas, and every man she had summoned to the house. He told her he knew what they were and what she was. When she tried to claim her status as his mother, Eleanor stepped forward to stand beside her brother, telling her that she was their enslaver and that those two things were not in conflict, calling it the entire horror of what she had done. Catherine looked at her children and saw 10 faces in the lamplight. Some were frightened, some furious, and the youngest were simply watching the older ones for cues, but every single one of them was standing behind Jonathan and Eleanor. Not one of them was on her side. Catherine had planned for everything: outside interference, worker resistance, the collapse of the Confederacy, and the arrival of federal troops, but she had not planned for this. She had given them intelligence and literacy, and without meaning to, she had given them enough of themselves to look at what she had built and call it by its real name. She grabbed the journals, the charts, and the vials of hair, clutching them against her chest. Her voice cracked as she insisted the records would survive to prove what she had built. She pushed past her children and ran down the hallway, through the main house, and out the door across the dark yard toward the quarters. Jonathan and Eleanor ran after her, but they were 30 seconds behind, and that was 30 seconds too long, because the quarters were already awake. The people inside had been waiting 16 years for exactly this moment. The sound of running from the main house had woken people. Doors opened and people emerged from the cabins into the cold March dark, standing in the yard between the quarters and the mansion, trying to understand what was happening. Then Catherine came across the yard towards them, running and wild-eyed, clutching those leather-bound journals against her chest, the vials of hair, the charts, and the physical archive of 16 years of documented horror. The people who saw her coming had been waiting 16 years. They had watched Ruth dragged back from the forest. They had watched Sarah die at 15, giving birth to a child she had not chosen. They had watched Violet walk into the Savannah River and not come back. They had endured every calculation, every forced pairing, every procedure in the small room behind the overseer's cottage, and every sale of someone they loved. They survived Catherine Thornhill's system the way people survive a very long winter, by enduring day by day, waiting for a season that kept refusing to arrive. It arrived on the night of March 17, 1864. What happened next has been reconstructed from fragments of military testimony, later confessions, oral tradition, and the memoir of Hope's granddaughter written in 1902. While the pieces do not agree on every detail, they agree on the shape. Catherine reached the quarters, and the night swallowed her. Jonathan and Eleanor arrived minutes later to find the journals scattered in the mud, pages torn and trampled, the glass vials smashed into the dirt, and the charts burning in a fire someone had built. Catherine was gone. Hope stood at the edge of the yard watching them. When Jonathan asked where she was, Hope simply said she was gone, and that was all they needed to know. When he asked what happened to her, Hope's voice was quiet and final, saying it was what she had coming. She told them they had a choice, to raise hell about their mother or understand that justice was done and let it rest. Jonathan looked at Eleanor, who nodded once, and said to let it rest. The next morning, Silas Kendrick searched the property and found nothing. He filed a report in Waynesboro, and the sheriff concluded Mrs. Thornhill had likely fled ahead of advancing Union troops. Not one person on that property said a word. The official record simply states that Catherine Danforth Thornhill disappeared and was never seen again. But 7 years later, a well driller found something 30 feet below the surface that had been waiting since March of 1864. The end of the Confederacy and the end of the system arrived within weeks. Most of the people held there left by the summer of 1865, scattering across Georgia and beyond, looking for family members or cities, anything that was not that land and its history. Eleanor stayed until 1867, learning what it meant to be a free person in a country still arguing about her deservingness. She moved to Savannah, worked as a seamstress, and married a carpenter named William Foster. She never had children and never spoke publicly about her mother or her childhood. When she died in 1903, her obituary made no mention of Burke County or Catherine. She carried it all to the grave by choice. Jonathan stayed longer, trying to farm the land, but by 1869 he gave up and drifted west to Texas under an assumed name. He died in 1891, and among his possessions was a small notebook where he had written, "I did not choose this," on every single line of every page. Thornhill Estate fell into ruin, partially burned in a suspicious fire in 1871, and was seized for unpaid taxes in 1878. The structures collapsed over decades, and the fields went to forest. Today, the foundation of the main house is buried under 160 years of leaf fall, and the collapsed cistern is overgrown with no historical marker to be found. But logic tells us about the 23 children who walked up those basement stairs in the spring of 1864. Some survived to adulthood and had children of their own, meaning people alive today carry Catherine Thornhill's genetic legacy without knowing it. They might have pale green eyes, auburn hair, or those sharp, distinctive cheekbones, never knowing that those features trace back to a woman who spent 16 years designing a system to make them exactly what they were. They would never know that the people who ended that system kept the secret for generations because they had earned the right to decide what got remembered and what got buried. But we know, and knowing it means we owe them something. The ones whose names the record kept, and the ones it never bothered to write down at all. History has a way of surfacing what powerful people bury. Catherine Thornhill spent 16 years building a system designed to be inescapable, constructed out of logic and the certainty that she was the smartest person in the room. She was right about the intelligence, but catastrophically wrong about everything else. She did not account for the fact that giving people the tools to think, reading, writing, and the ability to decode a cipher, means giving them the tools to think about you. She did not account for the fact that the people she treated as variables had spent those same 16 years watching her and waiting for the moment her system showed a crack. She did not account for Eleanor, Jonathan, Hope, Ruth, Thomas, and all the people whose names she recorded only as rootstock in a coded journal, and who were, in every way that actually mattered, more fully human than she ever managed to be. They outlasted her, they named what she had done, and they ended it themselves on their own terms. They kept the secret not out of guilt or shame, but out of a clear-eyed understanding that the story belonged to them, not to the courts, the sheriffs, or the official records. The story persists today because oral tradition is sometimes more honest than official history. It persists in genealogy archives and the careful coded language of family stories passed between people who learned that some truths are safer in whispers. It persists because it tells us something true and terrible about what absolute power does to a person who refuses to see others as real. And it persists because of the 23 children who walked up those stairs in the light, whose descendants are alive somewhere right now, carrying a legacy they don't understand. They are the final chapter of this story, a chapter that is still being lived and has never been closed. If this story found something in you, if it made you think about the buried histories in your own community, or the things your family carries without a name, those stories matter because the people in them matter. The past is never as far behind us as we would like to believe. See you in the next one.